Welcome, sleepy listener. Tonight, we're not stepping into war, not into politics, not into empires or pyramids or plagues. Tonight, we slip softly into the arenas of ancient sports, where people didn't just cheer for their team, they fought, they bled, and sometimes they didn't walk out. Because before stadium lights, sponsorships, and slow-motion replays, sports were raw and sometimes shockingly strange. This is the story of ancient games, the ones time forgot, the ones that make modern football look like a warm-up stretch, and the ones that, believe it or not, were considered fun. So close your eyes and let's step onto the dusty playing fields of the past. Chapter 1: Egyptian Sand Wrestling and Sacred Sprints. In the deserts of ancient Egypt, sport wasn't just for show, it was a form of sacred discipline. Tomb paintings over 4,000 years old show wrestlers locked in sweaty battle, surrounded by cheering nobles and watching priests. But Egyptian wrestling wasn't about brute strength. It was a technical, almost elegant dance of holds, counters, and stamina. Competitors wore nothing but loincloths, gripping each other's waists and ankles with practiced ease. They trained for years, and the best of them weren't just athletes. They were royal bodyguards. Nearby, young men raced chariots along dusty roads or sprinted barefoot beside the Nile, testing speed and endurance under the brutal sun. One ritual sprint, known as the Sed Fest, saw the pharaoh himself dash around a court to prove he was still strong enough to rule. It wasn't optional. If he couldn't finish the course, well, let's just say the gods weren't pleased. Chapter 2: Mesoamerican Ball Game: Life, Death, and Rubber. Now we shift to the humid courts of Mesoamerica among the Maya, Aztec, and Olmec. Here they played Olyamelalizi, often called the Mesoamerican ball game. The rules? Confusing. The ball? Heavy, made of solid rubber about the size of a watermelon. Players couldn't use their hands or feet. They bounced the ball using only their hips, knees, elbows, or sometimes special protective gear. The goal was to hit the ball through a stone ring set high in the wall. Think basketball hoop, but vertical and unforgiving. It was fast, it was dangerous, and in some cases, it was ritualistic. Because some versions of the game weren't just for sport. They were played to honor the gods, and the losing team, or in some stories the winners, were sacrificed. That's right, you didn't just lose the match, you lost your head. Imagine being the MVP of the season and getting marched to the temple steps. Still, they played, proudly, because to die in such a game was considered sacred. A direct pass into the afterlife. Chapter 3: Greek Pankration, the No-Rules Fight Club. Now the scene shifts again to ancient Greece, the land of the Olympics. You might picture discus and javelin, maybe graceful runners or nude athletes oiled for glory. But then there was Pankration. Pankration was a sport that combined wrestling and boxing, but stripped away almost all rules. No biting, no eye gouging, everything else allowed. It was brutal, a contest of domination with few protective measures and no weight classes. Men fought until someone gave up, passed out, or died. One match famously ended with a fighter applying a chokehold, and even after death, his opponent's hand remained clenched, locked in victory. Judges were armed with whips and rods, not to fight, but to make sure competitors didn't break the only two rules. And if you did, you got lashed, and the crowd cheered anyway, because in ancient Greece, pain was proof of courage. As the firelight fades and the wind settles over the empty arenas, we'll continue next with even stranger tales of Viking bone-breaking games, deadly team sports from the Mongol steppes, and the Roman pastime of executing criminals as halftime entertainment.
Chapter 4: Viking Games, where sports drew blood. Far up north, where snow blanketed the mountains and longboats carved through icy seas, the Vikings weren't known for taking it easy. They played games too. But Viking sports weren't just about fun. They were about proving strength, courage, and sometimes settling scores. One of their favorite games was called natlaklik. We don't know all the exact rules because the Vikings didn't leave an instruction manual, but based on sagas and archaeological clues, here's what we know. It involved a hard ball, wooden sticks, and a lot of hitting. Players formed teams and tried to get the ball past each other, often using their bodies as weapons. Shoving, tackling, even punching and wrestling were allowed. Games could last all day and sometimes ended with serious injuries or even deaths. There was no referee, no padding, and if things got too heated, well, the sagas tell of duels breaking out right there on the field, and no one stopped it. In Viking culture, even games were a kind of training for raids, for battle, for the brutal business of staying alive. Chapter 5: Mongol Polo, with a head, not a ball. Next, we gallop east, to the sweeping steppes of ancient Mongolia. The Mongols were master horsemen, fast, skilled, and fearless, so naturally their games were played on horseback. One of the most brutal? A game similar to polo, but instead of a ball, they used a severed goat's head. This sport, known later as buzkashi in Central Asia, has deep roots in Mongol military training. The goal? Snatch the goat head off the ground while riding full speed, then carry it across the field and drop it in the goal circle, all while dozens of other riders tried to wrestle it away. There were no teams, no boundaries, and no time limit. Sometimes the game went on for days. Men were knocked from horses, trampled, even dragged for yards while clinging to the goat's neck. And yet, it was an honor to play. The more bruised you were, the more respected. Chapter 6: Roman Spectacles, where sports meant death. Now we descend into the Colosseum, the roaring centerpiece of Roman entertainment. You know about the gladiators, but there were other far stranger games, often disguised as sport, but with deadly purpose. One such event was called a venatio, a staged animal hunt. Men called bestiari would be sent into the arena with little more than a spear or net to face lions, leopards, bears, and even hippos or rhinos. It wasn't sport, it was execution for the crowd's amusement. And then there were the mock naval battles. The Romans would flood the arena floor and recreate entire sea battles with prisoners acting as the rowers and soldiers. They wore armor. They fought with real weapons, and they drowned, died, or were cut down as the crowds tossed flowers and cheers. But one of the most chilling events? the mythological reenactments. To impress the audience, Romans would stage famous stories like Icarus falling from the sky, using real people. A condemned man would be strapped with wings and launched from a high scaffold, only to crash to his death as the audience applauded the realism. This was entertainment, the Roman version of a Saturday matinee. Chapter 7: Elephant Tug-of-War and Blood Sports of the East. In ancient India, royalty didn't just watch dancers and poets. They enjoyed sports too, many of them involving elephants. One recorded pastime was elephant tug-of-war. In this sport, teams of people would tie a long rope to an elephant and try to pull it across a line. Sometimes multiple elephants were used, each pulling in different directions. Other times, people competed against each other, tugging in opposite directions while the elephant watched. If the elephant got bored and stepped in, well, let's just say the game ended quickly. In ancient China, certain military games included archery on horseback, sword duels, and even public beatings as punishment for losing. While less bloody than Rome or the Mongols, the message was clear: losing had consequences.
Chapter 8: Human Chess, When You Are the Game Piece. In ancient India, strategy was king. The game of chaturanga, ancestor to modern chess, was more than just a pastime. But some rulers, particularly in parts of South and Central Asia, took things a step further. Instead of using wooden figurines, they used people. Yes, real human pieces were dressed as pawns, knights, bishops, and kings. They stood on giant outdoor chessboards, sometimes painted on temple courtyards or palace floors. As the game progressed, the ruler, seated high above, barked out commands. "Move the bishop to e4," and two guards would march the robed bishop forward. But here's where it gets brutal. If one piece captured another, the losing piece was often beaten, whipped, or in some stories, executed. It wasn't just a game. It was a spectacle, a show of dominance, and for those playing the roles of pawns, it was a very real risk. In time, this practice faded, replaced by carved ivory pieces and gold-plated boards. But the memory of human chess reminds us, even strategy games once came at a cost. Chapter 9: Korean Foot Archery and Skybound Arrows. Now we drift east to ancient Korea, where warriors trained in grace, balance, and some very unusual sports. One of the most peculiar was foot archery, a form of archery where the feet played a surprising role. Competitors would lie on their backs, place the bow between their feet, and pull the arrow back with their hands, aiming it skyward. It required incredible control, core strength, and aim. The arrows were designed for height, not just accuracy. The goal was shoot the arrow as far as possible, sometimes up to 500 meters, into a designated zone. And it wasn't just a test of skill. It was often used to settle disputes. Two nobles arguing over land rights might each take turns with the footbow, and the one who shot farther got to keep the farm. It was like court, but with arrows. Chapter 10: The Cliff Games of the Andes. High in the jagged mountains of the Andes, long before the Inca rose to power, smaller civilizations developed unique traditions for sport and selection. One particularly brutal challenge: the cliff endurance test. Boys approaching manhood were brought to a narrow ledge carved into a mountain face. There they balanced in harsh wind, staring down hundreds of feet of empty air. Their task was simple: stay standing, don't move, don't flinch,
Endure. You earn status in the tribe. But the cruel twist was if multiple boys lasted the same amount of time. The final challenge was a sprint across the narrow ledge, sometimes no wider than a goat's hoof. One slip, and the wind took you. The purpose wasn't cruelty. It was about proving bravery, showing that you feared nothing, not even the mountain. But for modern eyes, it's hard not to shiver. Chapter 11. Bloodless but Wild, Festival Sports of Ancient Thailand. In ancient Thailand and parts of Southeast Asia, many festivals included community sports that, while not deadly, were wonderfully bizarre. One crowd favorite? Greased pole climbing. A tall bamboo pole, sometimes over 20 feet high, was slicked with oil or animal fat. At the top hung prizes, gold coins, chickens, or flower garlands. Teams of young men, often shirtless and shouting, would try to form human ladders, stacking on each other's shoulders, slipping and falling, all to reach the top. It looked chaotic. It felt hilarious. And despite the bruises and broken pride, no one died. Then there was chicken boxing, not to be confused with cockfighting. In this version, humans wore chicken masks, squatted low, and flapped their arms while hopping toward each other. If you fell over, you lost. The crowd howled with laughter, because this sport wasn't about strength. It was about balance and not looking ridiculous. Sometimes ancient sports were brutal, and sometimes they were pure joy. Chapter 12. Feathers, Fire, and Fasting, the Sport of Endurance. In parts of Polynesia and the Pacific Islands, ancient contests weren't always about violence, but about endurance. Take, for example, the Feather Watch. Young boys, to earn their warrior status, were tasked with catching and guarding a single bird feather for 3 full days. They couldn't sleep, couldn't drop it, couldn't hand it to anyone else. They had to stay awake, guarding a symbol of their future while dancing, fasting, and chanting. Many hallucinated, some fainted, but if they succeeded, they were considered true adults, protectors of the tribe. It was a game with deep cultural meaning, and it proved that sometimes the mind was the fiercest battlefield of all.
Chapter 13. Gladiators at Sea, Flooded Arenas and Drowning Duels. When you think of Roman gladiators, you picture sand, swords, and the Colosseum. But did you know sometimes the Romans turned arenas into lakes? These watery spectacles were called naumachiae, mock naval battles held for entertainment. How? By building huge basins or flooding real stadiums and launching small wooden ships into the water. Condemned prisoners were given armor, oars, and spears, and they reenacted famous sea battles, often to the death. There were no real rules, no teams, just chaos. The ships collided, men fell overboard. Some drowned in heavy armor before they could even fight. To the audience, it was a thrilling show. To the men in the boats, a watery grave disguised as sport. Chapter 14. Aztec Flyers, Sports at the End of a Rope. In ancient Mesoamerica, some festivals included a ritual called the voladores, or flying men. Here's how it worked. 4 or 5 men climbed a 30-meter pole, sometimes even taller. One remained at the top, playing a flute and drum. The others tied ropes around their waists and then jumped off, spinning and spiraling to the ground in wide circles. As they descended, the ropes slowly unraveled, almost like they were gliding. It looked graceful, almost magical. But one wrong knot, one weak rope, and the flyer plummeted. Even though this was a religious ritual, honoring fertility, rain, or the gods, it was also a public display of balance, courage, and risk. In time, it became part of sport festivals too, a spectacle of controlled falling, half ceremony, half daredevil act. Today, it still survives as a cultural performance. But back then, it was sport, with stakes as high as the sky. Chapter 15. Ethiopian Stone Lifting, Not for Show. In ancient Ethiopia, long before modern gyms, young warriors trained by lifting massive stones. But these weren't just for exercise. Stone lifting was a respected sport and a rite of passage. The most famous contests were held during village festivals. A group of young men would gather and attempt to lift huge boulders. There were no weight classes, no technique guides. Just you, the stone, and your ancestors watching. Some stones were carved with inscriptions, the names of past champions. Others were burial markers, believed to bring honor to the lifter who could raise them. In some traditions, the stone was lifted above the head and thrown. In others, it was simply lifted off the ground. Even a few inches was considered heroic. Unlike other brutal sports, this one wasn't about harming others. It was about proving you could move the earth. Chapter 16. The High Himalayan Sky Climb. High in the Himalayas, ancient tribes held climbing games that tested more than muscle. The most daunting, a race up sheer cliffs to retrieve sacred flags or goat skulls tied to ledges. Without ropes, without shoes, without safety. Men and sometimes boys would scramble up loose rock faces as the village watched below. Some fell, some froze, but the one who reached the prize earned food, gifts, and often a bride. It wasn't sport in the modern sense. It was ritual, trial, and matchmaking all at once. Even in silence, even alone on a cliffside, sport was always more than a game. Chapter 18. Training Kings. The Royal Games of Persia. In ancient Persia, the sons of nobles were trained not just to rule, but to dominate in brutal sport. One game combined elements of chess, polo, wrestling, and war. It was called Zukhane, the House of Strength. Young princes would enter a sacred gym where they performed choreographed lifts, drills, and combat simulations to drums and chants. They wielded clubs weighing over 50 pounds, spun in dizzying circles, and performed synchronized movements meant to build power and rhythm. It wasn't meant to be fun. It was training for rule. Fail, and you were considered unworthy to lead. Win, and the throne waited. It was sport, ceremony, and statecraft, all under the watchful eyes of generals and priests. Chapter 19. When the crowd slept and the players bled. By the end of this long journey, one thing becomes clear. Ancient sports were not designed to be safe. They were not always fair. They weren't even always survivable. But they meant something. To fight, to fall, to risk, for honor, for ritual, for glory. Now as you drift in your own quiet moment, far from roaring arenas and howling crowds, you can let those echoes fade. No climbing cliffs, no flaming arrows, no leeches, goats, or gladiator blades. Just soft breath, stillness, and the warm hush of knowing that tonight you don't have to play. Not every game needs a winner. Some were simply stories waiting to be remembered. Good night.